Hello, guys. So let me get this. There we go. So, good morning. I was really hoping to start this lesson with you guys on Friday, but you guys got a snow day, which is really exciting. So, I hope you guys have enjoyed your 4-day weekend and that you are now watching this on Tuesday without me. But I will be back on Friday, so I will get to see you then. So let's talk about heredity. You just finished your quiz on asexual and sexual reproduction. And so this section is going to really focus more on how organisms that go through a sexual reproduction pass on their traits and their genes. Okay, so take a second or a minute and go ahead and engage your brain. So turn your book to page 325 and go ahead and engage your brain. So pause the video and engage your brain for a minute. Okay. Okay, so what exactly is heredity? Well, heredity broken down is simply this: the passing of genetic material from parents to offspring. So I put a picture of these cute puppies. These puppies are from the same litter, but they all look very, very different. And that is because of the way that sexual reproduction occurs. So it's really exciting. And if you think about your own family and think about your siblings and your parents, and you can say, man, my siblings and I look nothing alike. Or you can say, wow, my siblings and I look a lot alike. And if you guys probably look more similar, it's probably because one of your parents or your parents together have very dominant traits, which are, as we'll learn in this section, is going to mask more recessive traits. Where maybe if you look very different from your siblings, there might be more recessive type traits, or the combination of the traits just allows to have a big mixture. You guys, I don't know if some of you have seen my kids, but I do not think you could pick my kids in a crowd and know they were siblings. I mean, they are all built differently. They look different. Their hair is different. Their heights are different. It just they are very, very different. But one of the few things they all do have the same is they all have dark brown hair. Might be different shades, and they all have very similar eye color. Other than that, there's not a whole lot. Some have freckles, some don't, and so on. So just think about your own family and how similar or dissimilar you guys look is really going to play into your genetics. So there was a gentleman, or a monk specifically, but the name of Gregor Mendel, who studied and is actually what we refer to as the father of genetics. So he grew up on a farm. So he was really familiar with plants and how to propagate them and stuff. And so he actually had gone to the university. He wanted to be a teacher, but he could not pass his exams. He could not pass the final exams that would allow him to be a teacher. And so he went and became a monk. And so monks, yes, the monks you think about are probably the ones that, are more like a Buddhist monk they probably think of, and they wear the orange and they don't talk a lot and they seem really wise. But historically, monks have actually, they've done a lot of stuff. They've actually explored and did science and wrote, and are some of the reasons we have written history is because monks wrote it down, and they transcribed it. And so they would, because back then they didn't have printing presses, so it had to be handwritten. So a lot of times these books, if they're going to be more than one copy, the monks had to handwrite them. So monks actually have done a lot historically. So anyways, this Gregor Mendel was working in the garden. Like I said, he had grown up as a farmer, so he was very familiar with plants. And because he studied science and mathematics at the university, he was noticing some things as he was working in the garden. He noticed some things, and he wanted to explore. And so he worked with pea plants, because pea plants, if you've ever gardened, they grow pretty quickly, and you can easily, especially if you have a greenhouse, which back then the monks would have had greenhouse type things. It's just a glass building, and he could have grown plants year round. I think he was Austrian. I don't quote me on that, but I think he may have been Austrian. But he specifically cited 7 traits that he found in pea plants. And you probably had no idea. When you plant plants, you don't even think about this. But the height of the plant, the flower and pod position, the seed shape, the seed color, pod shape, pod color, and flower color are all genetic traits. And you'll see a picture of this in a minute. So a characteristic is a feature that has different forms in a population. So again, just looking around the room, you can see, oh, well, there's brunettes, and there are blonde-haired people, and there are dark-haired people, and there are redheads. And then look at the color of your skin. There are darker shades, and there are lighter shades. And looking at people's eye color and height and build, and if they have freckles or if they have dimples. All of those are characteristics that have different forms in the population. So someone with dimples can have 2 dimples. Some people can have 1 dimple. Some people can have no dimples. Okay, those are characteristics of a trait. So Mendel studied each of these characteristics individually. And he started with what we call a true breeding plant. And a true breeding plant is this. Sorry, that should say ones. I fixed it in your fill in the blank notes, but I forgot to fix this here before I started recording. Are ones that will always, always produce offspring with a certain trait when allowed to self-pollinate. So one good thing about the pea plants is they can self-pollinate and cross-pollinate. So pea plants can use their own pollen to pollinate other flowers on their on the plant. Not all plants can do that. That's what made these pea plants special, is that he could allow them to self-pollinate. So what that means is, like, this plant here is only going to produce round pea-shaped peas. And then this one is only going to produce wrinkled shaped peas over and over and over again. Because think about that. It only has the traits for a round pea. So it can't produce wrinkled peas because it can't pass it on. Just like we talked about, we're females, we cannot pass on the Y chromosome to make a boy because we don't carry that Y chromosome. If I don't have a brown-eyed trait in me, I can't pass on a brown-eyed trait to my offspring. It's the same thing with these plants. So he used these true breeding plants. He had allowed them to self-pollinate numerous times until he knew that he had these true breeding plants. Okay, and so the 7 different characteristics that he looked at were the seeds, whether they were round or wrinkled, and the color of them. Were they yellow or green? Then he looked at the actual color of the flower. Were they white or were they purple? Then he looked at the pods. Were they like this nice full pod, or were they kind of this constricted wrinkled pod? Was the pod yellow or the pod green? And then the stem, okay? Were the flowers and pods in the middle of the plant, or were the flowers and the pods at the tips, which is called terminal, the tips of the plant? Then we have the size. It says long. I've always referred to it as tall, but was it a tall plant or was it a short plant? So those are the 7 characteristics that he studied. And each of the characteristics that Mendel studied had 2 different forms, so round or wrinkled. There wasn't like a third option. There was just 2. And so traits actually depend on inherited factors. So Mendel took 2 sets of plants, one true breeding plant that produced, in this case, we're going to just look at yellow seeds, seed pods, and the other true breeding plant produced green seed pods. And so what he did is he had literally removed parts that allowed it to self-pollinate. And he controlled the pollination. So he cross-pollinated them. Okay. So he took the pollen from the yellow. I cannot stop yawning today. The yellow seed pod, and he put it on the green seed pod plant and vice versa. And he allowed them to fertilize and allowed them to have offspring. And he planted those seeds. And those are the parent plants. The two true breeding plants we refer to as our parent plant. But then they produced offspring, which we refer to as the F1 generation or the first generation, or just so you'll often see me shorten that to F1. It's the first generation. And he saw something really peculiar. All of the offspring had green seed pods. Every one of them. Okay? Even the yellow seed pod, the true breeding ones, up until this point had only ever produced yellow seed pods, produced green seed pods. And he referred to that as the dominant trait. So then he let those F1 generation plants self-pollinate. Okay? So the first one are the parent plants. There are true breeding ones. Our second plants are F1 generation. All green seed pods. All of them. He let those green seed pods self-pollinate. And he got the F2 generation, where 3/4 of the seed pods were green, but 1/4 were yellow. So let's say he had 12 plants, 9 of them, roughly, were green seed pods, and the other 3 were yellow seed pods. So the yellow trait came back. It had been hidden or masked in the F1 generation, but then were allowed to come back in this F2 generation, which produced, so it was really cool. So that disappeared and reappeared. So he hypothesized that each plant must have 2 inheritable factors, which we know are genes, but he didn't know that at the time. And he said, okay, they must get one from one parent and one from the other parent. And so genes are segments of DNA that we find in chromosomes that give our bodies instructions for making specific characteristics. They really do code for protein, and then the protein actually is what carries out and creates these characteristics. So humans and plants actually inherit their genes from their parents. Each parent gives one set of genes to the offspring. And so the offspring then has 2 versions of that same gene. Remember, because of meiosis, the parents are only able to send over, or pass on one set, okay? One version. And then that combination of that version gives us what we see. So these 2 different versions of a gene are referred to as alleles, okay? And these alleles are often represented by letters. You guys remember, some of you remember I did a Punnett square on the board and I wrote like letters and then crossing, and some of you were like, I have no idea what you're doing. But I wrote letters. Those letters represent these alleles, these traits. Our dominant allele or our dominant trait is represented by a capital letter. And then our lowercase are our recessive alleles. So in the case of our green seed pods and our yellow seed pods, the green seed pods are going to be, usually we choose the first letter of that dominant trait. We usually use that. So it's a capital G. So for this case, because it's a green seed pod, it would be represented by a capital G. And then the recessive form of that trait would just be the lowercase letter. So you don't switch letters. Like we wouldn't make it a Y in this case. Make it a capital G for green and a lowercase g for yellow. Okay. And if you get two dominants or two recessive, so two capital G's or two lowercase g's, you are going to get what is called homozygous. Remember, this prefix, homo, means same. Remember that. I've told you guys that many times. You're going to see that prefix in front of a lot of words. And that's because that word means same. And like zygous, kind of like a zygote, right? So it is the same. So two capital G's or two lowercase g's means that it is homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. So our true breeding plants, our green seed pod is homozygous dominant. Two capital G's for green seed pod. Our yellow seed pod is homozygous recessive because it has two lowercase letters. In this case, two lowercase g's because they have the yellow seed pod. Okay, now those true breeding plants could only pass on the letters that they carry. So when they self-pollinate, the dominant capital G's can only pass on capital G's, and our recessive lowercase g's only pass on lowercase g's. That's why all of their offspring were always exact, had those exact traits, because that's all they could pass on. But when we took the ability to self-pollinate away, and we crossed those two, the capital G plant could only pass on the capital G, and the lowercase g plant could only pass on the lowercase g, which meant that our F1 generation has a capital G and a lowercase g. Okay? This is called heterozygous. Hetero meaning different. One capital, one lowercase. And when we write this, we always write the capital letter first and the lowercase letter second. Always. So these alternate forms of genes, which are the alleles, determine the traits of all living things. And the combination of these alleles are what we refer to as the genotype. And I remember the difference between genotype and phenotype like this. Genotype are my genes. They are my alleles. They are the letters that I am seeing, the capital G and the lowercase g. Those are my genes. So that's my genotype. My phenotype is what I can see with my eyes. They're the observable traits. So I remember this as if I take a photo, I can see it. And so photo and phenotype both begin with PH. So genotype has the genes. I can see the letters, the alleles. Phenotype is simply what I can see. Okay. So then we have what I've been using these words dominant and recessive. Dominant allele contributes to the phenotype if one or two copies are present in the genotype. So what does that mean? So again, think back. And you guys can be writing down these letters as like an example in your INB. You can do like parent generation, capital G times lowercase g, and then like an arrow pointing down and then an F1 generation. And then actually, I'm probably going to go to school and record after I'm done recording this. And I will write that on the board for you guys so that you can see that and then copy that into your INB. So the F1 generation is a combination of that, is a capital G and a lowercase g. And think back, what color were these seed pods? Green. Because what letters are involved in this genotype: capital G, lowercase g. If there is a capital G anywhere in the genotype, whether it is two capital G's or a capital G and a lowercase g, the offspring is going to show the dominant trait. That is why they were all green, because every single offspring had a capital G in it, because one of the parents was a true breeding homozygous dominant carrier. Okay, it could only pass on capital G's, which means all of their offspring are going to have that dominant trait. That is why it is dominant. It masks or can hide that recessive. Okay, so now you know the phenotype is green seed pod of the parent, yellow seed pod of the parent, green seed pod of the F1 generation. That's the phenotype. The genotype is capital G, lowercase g, and then the F1 generation, capital G, lowercase g. That's the genotype. Phenotype is what we can see. So the recessive allele, the only way an offspring is going to show the recessive trait is if it carries only recessive letters, recessive alleles. So the only way that the offspring, I'm going to say it again, the only way that the offspring is going to show the recessive trait is if it carries both recessive alleles. So in this case, it has to have the lowercase g 2 times in order to have the yellow seed pod, which is why there are none in our F1 generation. Okay? So if the genotype has one capital letter, the phenotype is going to be the dominant trait. Okay? Now, in the next section, we're going to do Punnett squares and pedigrees, and you're going to see how these letters combine and see how it works. Okay? So we're not going to go into more depth, but then when he did have the F2 generation, when he allowed them to, remember I told you when he allowed them to, the F1 generation self-pollinate, that recessive gene showed back up in 1/4 of them. Okay. And like I said, in the next section, I will show you how that works. But there are often where lots of genes affect a single trait. So in the case of our eye color, our skin color, our hair color, even like the texture of your hair, whether it is straight or curly or wavy, all that, that's actually a combination of a bunch of different genes together, making that offspring. So it's actually a lot of things together. It's not just as simple as mom has blue eyes, dad has brown eyes, so I'm going to have brown eyes. It's not really that simple. We make it that simple when we're just talking because, brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes, but it isn't just one gene. And so, and that's how we have multiple shades of blue eyes or multiple shades of brown eyes, is because of what the combination of those genes are gives you different shades of the same color. So like my husband's got really light blue eyes, almost grayish green at times, where I have like a darker blue eye. And so all of our kids have blue eyes, and they're all kind of a shade closer to mine because mine are probably more dominant than his lighter blue eyes. But again, it's the combination. And so remember that there isn't always a one-to-one relationship between that trait and that gene. So a lot of traits don't have really simple patterns of inheritance. So don't think that there's like one eye color gene and one hair color gene. That's not really how it works. Sometimes there's multiple genes that affect one single trait. But there's also times where one single gene can actually influence lots of traits. So influence. So the picture in the book, if you're following along in the textbook, there's a picture of this beautiful white Bengal tiger, and he has blue eyes. The single gene that causes that tiger to have white fur also causes him to have blue eyes. Okay, so one gene affects both this fur color and the eye color. There's actually a lot of different genetic disorders in us humans that actually are caused by a single gene. An example is the sickle cell anemia. These are blood vessels over here, not blood vessels, blood cells. These are normal. This is the sickle cell. So a sickle is like a C-shaped thing. A sickle is an old tool in agriculture that they would use to like cut down wheat. So it's like that kind of that C-shaped tool. Okay. Sickle cell anemia. So there's instruction, for producing a protein in the red blood cells that causes it to be the sickle shape when O2, so oxygen, is low. But if you notice, this shape actually gets stuck in the blood vessels. It's not nice and round. It can actually like get stuck in there, which can cause blockages, which is not good. It also causes damage to the spleen and so on. There's a few other things. But at the same time, one kind of cool thing that if you have sickle cell anemia, you're actually immune to malaria, the disease malaria that is, deadly or can be deadly. So even though this causes a lot of health problems, it also has some benefits as well. So, which is kind of cool. And I have heard that it is actually sickle cell anemia happens to be more dominant in sub-Saharan African and then some places in South America, the Caribbean, Central America, because, and it's amazing that way, because that is where malaria is biggest. You don't hear a lot about malaria cases here in the United States. Like, it's not something we deal with a whole lot. But you go to the equator where there's a ton of mosquitoes and it's a ton of disease carrying mosquitoes. That's why you have to get certain like vaccines if you go to those places before you even travel. You have to get shots and stuff before you travel there because of things like this. You sleep with nets around your beds and whatnot because of the malaria that is in the mosquitoes. But people there naturally have this immunity to this disease. We don't. Native, lighter skinned people, white people, a lot of times, because we're from northern countries. That's why we're lighter, because we're from where there's less sun. Historically, that is why it's not as common, because we don't have mosquitoes where it's cold. Okay. So people from England and Scotland and Russia and Canada, they don't really have that natural immunity in them because there wasn't a need for that. So at some point in history, there was this mutation that then allowed some of these people to become naturally immune to a disease that is really bad. Now, granted, sickle cell anemia is not that fun either, but there is just this natural immunity, and it does affect millions of people throughout the world, and it is more common among people whose ancestors came from those equatorial territories, which is just really kind of really fascinating. But at the same time, the environment can also affect or influence traits. So this adorable Arctic fox here, you guys have seen if you've ever been to the Columbus Zoo, they're these beautiful white. This is what we think of when we think of an Arctic fox. But they actually have a gene that's responsible for their coat color. And this gene is actually influenced and affected by light. So in the winter and in the cold parts of the world, there's not as much sunlight, which means that the hair on the fox grows in white because there's less daylight. But in the summer months, or if it travels a little south, there's more light, more daylight. So the hairs grow in brown. So yes, this is the same animal because I looked it up. I said Arctic fox, white, Arctic fox, brown fur. This is the picture I got. So But a lot of the Arctic fox live in the polar caps. They never ever come down, so they're going to stay white. But if they stay down and they move down far enough, they will become brown in the warmer months. So there are a few exceptions to that dominant and recessive combination. So if a trait is dominant or recessive, the dominant one is going to mask that recessive trait. But there's something called incomplete dominance. An incomplete dominance is where each allele in a heterozygous individual influences phenotypes, which means both of them affect the offspring. So there's a blending of the two. So in this case, we have like this dark pink or red snapdragon, and we have this white snapdragon. And when you combine them, you get this light pink snapdragon. You don't get a dark pink and a white like you saw with Mendel's peas. You get this beautiful blending. This is how we get a lot of different colors of flowers. This is very prominent in flowers. I'm sure this pink one probably came from a red and a white one. If you cross a red and a blue one, you're going to get purple. Red and yellow, you're going to get orange, and so on. You're going to get this blending of these traits. Sometimes it won't be a full color like that. No, never mind. Sorry, wrong thing. But they're going to produce all the same offspring. And so it's really, really pretty. It's this blending of the traits. Then the last one is called co-dominance. And one of the easiest examples is our blood types. Humans have 4 blood types: A, B, AB, and O. And in co-dominance, both of the alleles in a heterozygous individual contribute to the phenotype. So this is not a blending. This is when they are both showing equally. Not a blending, but they have both traits. So if one of your parents is A, one of your parents is B, you could get AB blood. Now, again, if it is AA and BB, you are going to get AB blood. That's all you can get. But if this is AO and then BB blood, you could get A blood or AB blood or B blood, BO blood. Okay, if this is AO, BO, you could get any of the blood types, A, B, O, or AB. And again, you'll understand that better when I get to actually show you the breakdown in the Punnett squares. So this right here, AB blood, is a co-dominance. It means that I have both traits. So on this case, if you look, the blood A has these antigens on it, okay, which means that this B blood, if you were to accidentally get the wrong blood transfused into you, it would be really, really bad because your body thinks it's a foreign body and it's going to attack it, okay? Because it literally has different antigens. It's like, nope. I recommend reading the text, this section, the codominance section. It really goes into detail explaining the antigens and stuff like that. So definitely read that paragraph in your textbook. The AB, you could put any blood in there whatsoever. So if you are an AB person, if your blood's AB, that means if you ever have to have a blood transfusion, it doesn't matter pretty much what blood you have. You'll be fine for the most part. But there's also positive and negatives, and those play into it. But we're going to say for the most part, you could get any blood. Okay. But then O blood is what we call the universal donor. You see how there's no antigens on it? It means that any of these blood types can receive O blood, but O blood can't receive any of these bloods. So this is the universal recipient, and this is the universal donor. So if you ever happen to have an O blood, they're going to want you to donate blood as much as you physically can, because it doesn't matter what blood type you have. You can, someone can receive that life-saving O blood. So that's really important. Okay, so this is Heredity. It's fascinating. We're going to do some fun labs. Definitely do some more fun labs once we get to Punnett squares and pedigrees. You guys are going to track some traits that you have. You guys are going to do some labs. We're going to create, like, I like to call them creepy alien babies, because for whatever reason they're like green faced and yellow faced and purple eared and red nosed, and it's just kind of fun. So we're going to just do a lot of fun labs. After the next section, we will have a lab or two with this heredity, and so on. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this. So you're going to have some quizzes. You'll have a quiz later this week, or next Monday. So I hope you guys had a really great 4-day weekend, and I will see you later after.